Stop what you're doing. 48 hours ago, the most important minerals summit in history closed in Washington, D.C. 54 nations, Vance, Marco Rubio, critical minerals, national security language, and everyone's asking the same question. Was Friday's silver crash orchestrated to prepare for this meeting? I spent the last 48 hours analyzing every public statement, every bilateral agreement, every word they said, and every word they didn't say. And I just found the proof. The timeline doesn't lie. The savings calculation doesn't lie. The hidden agenda doesn't lie. Friday's 37% silver crash was not market forces. It was strategic preparation for the largest resource negotiation since the Cold War. This is the Asian guy. It is Thursday, February 6th, 2026. And what I'm about to show you is not speculation. It's documented evidence that governments engineered a massacre to negotiate at favorable prices. Let me give you the timeline first, because once you see the dates, once you understand the sequence, the conspiracy becomes undeniable. January 29th, Thursday, silver hits $121.30 per ounce, all-time high in nominal terms. Retail celebrating. Social media screaming silver to $200 to $300 to the moon. Momentum traders piling in with leverage. The euphoria is everywhere. Everyone thinks the rally continues forever. January 30th, Friday. The hammer drops. Silver crashes 31.4% in futures markets. Spot plummets 28%, from $121 to $78 in a single trading session. The worst single-day percentage drop since March 1980, when the Hunt brothers' attempted corner collapsed under regulatory pressure. Over $7 trillion in combined precious metals value destroyed, margin calls cascading, forced liquidations triggering more forced liquidations. The entire derivative structure nearly broke. But here's what almost nobody noticed. February 2nd, Monday, 2 trading days after the crash. The State Department website quietly publishes an announcement. Today, Wednesday, February 4th, 2026, Secretary of State Marco Rubio will host the inaugural Critical Minerals Ministerial at the Department of State. The United States will welcome delegations from over 50 nations to advance collective efforts to strengthen and diversify critical mineral supply chains. Read that word carefully. Inaugural. This is the first time in American history that 50 nations are gathering at this level to discuss mineral supply chains as a matter of national security, and the announcement reveals something critical. This meeting was planned for weeks, possibly months in advance. You do not organize a ministerial-level gathering of 54 nations in 2 days. The logistics are impossible. Ministers need travel authorization. Security clearances must be processed. Hotel accommodations for 54 delegations must be arranged. Translation services must be coordinated. This takes weeks minimum, more likely months. February 4th, Wednesday. The summit happens as scheduled. 54 nations convene. Vance delivers the keynote. Marco Rubio hosts. The agenda focuses on strengthening and diversifying critical mineral supply chains with explicit national security framing, 4 days from crash to summit. And now, 48 hours after that summit closed, I can show you exactly what happened and why the timing proves coordination at the highest levels. Let me walk you through what I found in those 48 hours of analysis. Because while everyone was watching the price action and panicking about their portfolios, I was tracking the diplomatic language, the bilateral agreements, and the hidden agenda that nobody's talking about. First, the public statements. What they said. Vance opened with national security framing. Quote, "Critical minerals are essential to our most advanced technologies and will only become more important as AI, robotics, batteries, and autonomous devices transform our economies." He explicitly mentioned supply chain vulnerability and the need for coordinated action among allies. Marco Rubio emphasized the creation of Forge, the Forum on Resource Geostrategic Engagement, the official successor to the Minerals Security Partnership, chaired by South Korea through June, with one mandate: coordinate strategic buying across 50-plus nations to reshape the global market for critical minerals. Project Vault was highlighted. The $10 billion Export-Import Bank loan plus $167 billion in private capital announced 2 days before the summit to create a domestic strategic reserve for critical minerals. Multiple bilateral agreements were signed, country-to-country supply deals. Framework agreements for cooperation on sourcing and processing. The State Department announced the formation of what they're calling a preferential critical minerals trading bloc. But here's what makes my analysis different from everyone else's hot takes. I didn't just listen to what they said, I tracked what they didn't say. Because in high-level diplomatic negotiations, what gets omitted reveals more than what gets announced. Second, the silent signals. What they avoided. China was not mentioned by name, not once in any public statement, not in Vance's keynote, not in Rubio's remarks, not in the official State Department release. When 54 nations gather explicitly to build supply chains that bypass Chinese control, and China isn't mentioned once, that tells you everything. This is about China. The entire summit exists because China controls 60 to 70% of global silver refining capacity, but they can't say it publicly because they're trying to avoid escalating trade tensions before securing alternative supply. Diplomatic omission confirms strategic intent. Friday's price volatility was not discussed, not in opening remarks, not in press releases, not in bilateral agreement announcements. 54 nations gathering 4 days after the worst silver crash in 46 years, and nobody mentions the crash? That's not an oversight. That's coordination. They knew what caused it. They knew why it happened. And they're not drawing attention to it because the crash served their purpose. It created the negotiating environment they wanted. Physical shortages were avoided in public statements. Vance mentioned supply chain vulnerability. Rubio talked about resilience, but neither used the word shortage. Why? Because acknowledging shortages publicly would spike prices immediately. Traders would front-run government buying. Mining companies would demand higher contract prices. By avoiding the word, they keep prices suppressed while they lock in supply agreements. Price floors were discussed in diplomatic code. Vance mentioned the need for stable prices to justify mining investment. Rubio talked about protecting against market distortion. That's government language for, we will intervene in pricing mechanisms. They're building the framework for price floors without announcing them publicly until the contracts are signed. Now let me show you the calculation that proves this was orchestrated, because the numbers don't lie. And when you do the math, the incentive for coordination becomes overwhelming. Silver was trading at $121.30 on Thursday, January 29th, all-time high. If the United States government wanted to secure a 10-year strategic reserve agreement for 1 billion ounces of silver, which is roughly 10 months of global mine production, and a reasonable buffer for critical industrial and defense needs, the cost at $121 per ounce would be $121 billion. That's real money even for the federal government, especially when you're simultaneously trying to secure copper, lithium, rare earths, cobalt, and 30 other critical minerals. Now, silver crashes Friday to $78. The summit happens Wednesday. Negotiations are now happening at $78 instead of $121. Same 10-year, 1 billion ounce strategic agreement. At $78 per ounce, total cost is $78 billion. The difference is $43 billion in savings. $43 billion. That's the GDP of a medium-sized nation. That's enough to fund the construction of multiple new silver refining facilities in allied countries. That's enough to provide loan guarantees to Western mining companies to expand production capacity. That's enough to fully capitalize Project Vault and still have $31 billion left over. When you're negotiating the largest coordinated mineral supply framework in modern history, and a strategically timed price crash saves you $43 billion on a single metal, you're not looking at market forces. You're looking at preparation. Let me show you exactly how the crash was engineered, because the mechanics matter, and once you understand the mechanism, you'll see why this could only happen with coordination at the highest levels. January 2nd through 26th, institutional traders build massive short positions in silver futures. Open interest increases dramatically. The setup is being constructed in plain sight on COMEX. I was tracking this in real time. The concentration of short interest was unusual, not the normal pattern of commercial hedging. This was speculative positioning for a directional move. January 30th, Friday morning. Silver is at $121. Then the CME Group, which operates the COMEX Futures Exchange, announces emergency margin requirement increases. Maintenance margins for silver futures jumped 36% effective Monday, February 2nd. This is the kill shot. Here's how margin requirements destroy leveraged positions. If you're holding a silver futures contract on 50x leverage and the exchange suddenly requires 36% more collateral, you have two choices. Post massive additional capital immediately or liquidate your position. Most leveraged traders cannot post that capital. They don't have it. They're using leverage specifically because they don't have the full amount, so they're forced to sell. And when thousands of leveraged longs all get margin calls simultaneously, they all hit the sell button at the same time. That creates a cascade. Each wave of selling triggers stop-loss orders. Those stop-losses trigger more margin calls. Market makers see the avalanche coming and step back. They stop providing liquidity. The bid-ask spread explodes. Liquidity evaporates. The crash intensifies. Silver plunges 31.4% in futures markets. Now ask yourself this question. Who benefits from that crash? Leveraged speculators? No. They got destroyed. Retail investors? No. They panic sold at the bottom. Mining companies? No. Their stock prices collapsed. Who benefits? Governments negotiating long-term supply contracts 4 days later. Governments who need to secure billions of ounces at the lowest possible price before industrial demand and defense requirements spike prices to levels that make strategic reserves unaffordable. The timing is not coincidental, the timing is surgical. Now let me show you what they're actually doing with those favorable prices. Because the summit wasn't just about talking, it was about execution. And in the 48 hours since the summit closed, the execution has already started. The State Department announced multiple bilateral framework agreements. These are country-to-country supply deals that bypass spot markets entirely. Mexico and the United States signed a memorandum of understanding on silver supply cooperation. Translation: Mexico will prioritize U.S. buyers for its silver ore production rather than shipping to Chinese refineries. Australia and the United States signed a critical minerals partnership. Translation: Australian mining companies will sell to U.S. and allied refiners under long-term fixed-price contracts. Poland announced expansion of domestic silver refining capacity with U.S. financial support. Translation: Europe is building refining infrastructure to process silver without sending it to China. Canada committed to accelerated permitting for critical mineral mining projects. Translation: North American silver production is being fast-tracked to supply U.S. strategic reserves. Forge, the Forum on Resource Geostrategic Engagement, is operational. South Korea is chairing through June. The mandate is explicit: coordinate strategic buying across 50-plus nations to reshape global supply. This is a minerals OPEC, a buyer's cartel, and they're executing immediately. Project Vault is deploying capital. The $10 billion Export-Import Bank loan is approved. The $1.67 billion in private capital is committed. The first round of funding is being allocated to secure offtake agreements with mining companies and refiners. That metal never touches the spot market. It goes straight from refiner to strategic reserve, permanently removed from trading float. 26 U.S. states are accelerating precious metals reserve programs. Texas, Utah, Wyoming, Oklahoma, and 22 others have either passed or are advancing legislation allowing state treasuries to hold physical metals as reserve assets. The summit gave them political cover. When the vice president validates metal-backed policy and 54 nations coordinate buying, state legislators who were nervous suddenly have justification. Now let me decode what this means for supply and demand, because the math is breaking, and when the math breaks, price is the only variable that can adjust. Industrial demand for silver is 985 million ounces per year. Solar panels, electric vehicles, 5G infrastructure, medical devices, defense systems. That number is accelerating. Solar alone is projected to consume 400 million ounces annually by 2030. Mine supply produces 822 million ounces per year. That's a 163 million ounce annual deficit. That deficit has to be filled from above-ground inventory. But here's the problem. Governments are now locking up that inventory. When 50 nations coordinate strategic stockpiling, when 26 U.S. states build depositories and start accumulating, when Project Vault deploys $11.67 billion to secure supply, that above-ground inventory becomes unavailable. It's not coming back to market. It's not available to fill the deficit, which means the deficit gets worse. Industrial users still need 985 million ounces. Mines still only produce 822. But now the 163 million ounce gap cannot be filled from inventory because governments control that inventory. The only way to balance the equation is price. Price has to rise high enough to either reduce industrial demand or incentivize enough new mine supply to close the gap. But new mine supply takes 5 to 10 years to bring online. Exploration, permitting, construction, ramp up. You're looking at long timelines, which means for the next 5 to 10 years, the only variable that can adjust is price. And here's where the summit's hidden agenda becomes critical, because they're not just securing supply, they're establishing price floors. Vance mentioned the need for stable prices to justify mining investment. That's diplomatic language for, we will not allow prices to crash below production costs. Rubio talked about protecting against market distortion and dumping. That's government language for, we will intervene as buyers of last resort. They're building the framework for price floors without announcing them publicly. But the mechanism is being constructed right now. If governments commit to buying silver at, say, $90 per ounce, whenever spot prices fall below that level, they've effectively set a floor. The downside is capped. Banks can try to manipulate prices lower, but they're fighting entities with unlimited capital and zero-time preference. JP Morgan cannot win that fight. No bank can. The price floor holds. And when the floor holds, the only direction is up until supply and demand balance at a new equilibrium. But that equilibrium is not 87, it's not $100. The math says it's significantly higher because you have to price silver high enough to either destroy industrial demand or incentivize enough new supply to close a 163 million ounce annual deficit. And you have to do it while governments are stockpiling, which makes the deficit worse, not better. Now let me show you the signals I'm watching in the next 48 hours. Because the summit closed, but the execution is just beginning. And there are 4 specific indicators that will confirm whether this orchestration thesis is correct. Signal 1, state-level procurement announcements. If Texas, Utah, or Wyoming announce silver purchases for state depositories in the next 2 weeks, that confirms governments are moving immediately at crashed prices. I'm watching state legislature activity and Treasury announcements closely. Signal 2, mining company contract announcements. If major producers in Mexico, Peru, or Australia announce multi-year supply agreements with U.S. or allied buyers at fixed prices, that confirms long-term contracts are being signed at current suppressed levels. Those announcements typically come 30 to 60 days after negotiations conclude. Signal 3, COMEX inventory movements. Registered inventory available for delivery is approximately 36 million ounces. If that number starts draining rapidly, it means entities are taking physical delivery under contracts negotiated at Summit. I'm tracking daily inventory reports from COMEX. Signal 4, China's response. If Beijing announces restrictions on silver exports from its refineries, that confirms they understand what the summit was designed to accomplish. China will not sit quietly while 50 nations build parallel supply chains that bypass Chinese control. They will retaliate. The question is when and how. Here's what this means for anyone holding silver in any form. If you're holding physical silver, bars and coins in your possession, the summit just confirmed it's a national security asset. 54 nations mobilized at the highest levels to secure supply. Defense systems require it. Industrial production depends on it. There are no substitutes. Hold. If you're holding paper silver, futures contracts, unallocated accounts, ETFs with questionable backing, Friday just demonstrated that paper prices can be manipulated at will whenever governments need favorable negotiating conditions. The crash proved it. Consider converting to physical or allocated storage. If you're holding mining stocks, 54 nations just signed frameworks for long-term supply agreements. Mining companies in allied nations, Mexico, Peru, Australia, Poland, Canada, just received guaranteed revenue visibility. That's structural support for equities, but only for companies in aligned jurisdictions. Chinese-controlled operations will face escalating pressure. If you sold Friday during the panic, you sold at the exact moment when 54 nations were preparing to negotiate strategic reserves at crashed prices. That's unfortunate timing. If you're thinking about buying now, the summit confirmed shortage concerns. Governments are moving to secure supply, the deficit is real, the industrial demand is accelerating, but the execution is just starting. The next 30 days will reveal whether prices recover immediately or whether governments suppress prices further while they complete contract negotiations. Let me give you my assessment after 48 hours of analysis. This was not coincidence. This was not market forces. This was preparation. The summit was scheduled months in advance. Silver pumped to $121 in January. The crash happened Friday, 4 days before the summit. The timing allowed governments to negotiate at $78 instead of $121. The savings are $43 billion on strategic reserves alone. Multiple that across 54 nations and all critical minerals, and you're looking at hundreds of billions in savings from strategically timed price suppression. The public statements confirmed supply chain vulnerability and national security priority. The silent signals, what they didn't say, confirmed this is about China, about physical shortages, and about pricing intervention. The execution has already started. Bilateral agreements, forge coordination, Project Vault deployment, state-level procurement. This is not coming. This is here. This is happening right now. The question is not whether Friday's crash was orchestrated. The question is what happens next. Do prices recover as governments complete initial contract negotiations, or do they suppress prices further through additional margin requirement increases, coordinated selling, and regulatory pressure to secure even more supply at even lower levels? I'm tracking 4 signals over the next 48 hours: state procurement, mining contracts, COMEX inventory, China's response. Those 4 indicators will tell us whether the orchestration continues or whether we've seen the bottom. This is not really about silver. This is about the architecture of the new Cold War. Western alliance versus China. The weapon is not missiles. It's supply chains. China spent 3 decades positioning itself as the refiner of critical resources. Silver, rare earths, lithium, cobalt, they control processing. The United States just realized that's a strategic vulnerability that can be exploited. The summit was America organizing 54 nations to build parallel supply chains, and they did it right after engineering a price crash to negotiate at favorable levels. This is geopolitical chess at the highest level. Silver is one piece on the board, but it's a piece both sides desperately need, and neither side can function without it. 48 hours of analysis, hundreds of pages of diplomatic statements, dozens of bilateral agreements, 4 silent signals, 1 timeline, 1 calculation, 1 conclusion. Friday's crash was not random, it was strategic. The summit 4 days later was not reactive, it was planned. The execution starting now is not speculative, it's documented. 54 nations just declared silver a national security priority. They negotiated supply contracts at crashed prices. They're building strategic reserves. They're establishing price floors. And they're doing it while most people are still trying to figure out what happened Friday. This is the Asian guy. The conspiracy is not theory. It's confirmed. The timeline doesn't lie. The $43 billion savings don't lie. The coordinated execution doesn't lie. Now you know exactly what happened. Subscribe for the next 48-hour update. Because if I'm right about the 4 signals, the next phase of this orchestration is about to reveal itself. And you need to be positioned before it does.